All right, so welcome to the Develop module. We're going to take an in-depth look at some of the parts of the Develop module and how they can help you with your editing. Up here, of course, we have our histogram. Now, the histogram gives a bit of a look at where your exposure is happening in the image. On the left, we have the blacks, then the shadows, then the exposure, aka midtones. Here we have highlights, and then whites. If we look over here in the top left-hand corner, there's a bit of a triangle. If we click on that, you will see that in the image, it highlights certain areas in blue. These areas are indicative of true black. So these are all areas where there's black clipping, which means there's no information being shown there. We can click that off. If you notice, the other one here is actually gray. This one's white, it's representing luminance. This one's gray. That's because this one represents highlight clipping or white clipping basically, and currently there is not any happening. If we boost the exposure, we can see that we now have come up here into the whites, the highlights, and we'll just boost a little bit more. Here you can see the areas that are highlighted in red are now pure white in the image, so there's no information there, no texture, nothing. So that gives us an indication of that fact. Here you see this triangle here has switched to blue. It's now representing that the blacks or the shadows over here are primarily in the blue. And of course, when we click on it to highlight it, we can't actually see it showing up in the image there. That's because it is no longer clipping. You'll notice that it's kind of, I guess, de-emphasized. It's not as bright as this one is. But I'll just reset the image. The histogram is interesting in Lightroom because you can also use it to adjust these tone values. So if you highlight or hover over a certain part of it, you can see that you will actually be highlighting a certain slider bar. And if you are to move and basically click and drag to the left or right, you'll see that the slider and the histogram respond accordingly. What this is doing isn't pulling things to the right, except when you're using the exposure portion here. You're actually just changing the values, the luminance values of this or this or this or this portion of the graph, which is to say that you are increasing or decreasing the highlight, shadows, whites, blacks, etc. These sliders and these adjustments are only going to be able to act on the things that fall within their range. So the highlight slider will only be able to adjust things that can be in its range. However, and this is important to know, if you adjust the exposure, it can bring new parts of the image into the range of the highlights, shadows, what have you, or out of the ranges of these values as well. And that can cause this slider, for instance, to affect parts of the image which it previously didn't. Please keep that in mind. You might want to adjust exposure first. There is a reason why it's at the top of the list here, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. The histogram here shows you some information about how the image was taken. In this case, it also shows us that we have an original and a smart preview that can be edited without having to be connected to our database file. It's not our problem at the moment because everything's on our USBs. Here we have the editing function highlighted, I suppose. If you click next to that, right below the histogram, there's this bar of 5 icons. This is cropping and straightening. So cropping allows us to actually change the cropping of the image. Basically allows us to throw away certain parts of the edges. Here the aspect ratio is the original aspect ratio, which is going to keep this box the same. If we come over here, it says original. There's a lock. If you were to click on this lock and unlock it, it now will actually unlock the aspect ratio and give you full custom control of it, as is indicated here by custom. We're just going to reset that here. Let's say you wanted to turn a portrait image into a landscape crop. You would grab the corner and you would move diagonally in the direction of the long edge. Just grab this See how it's now changed to landscape? Now I'm going to pull this corner up this way. And we're back to a portrait orientation. There's other ways you can do it. You can click here on original, for instance, and you'll see you have a bunch of different options. You can enter custom here, where you can actually put a specific aspect ratio if you know if it's 2:3, 3:2, that type of thing. Here we have our common sizes like 8:10, 5:7, 4:6. And yeah, essentially 1:1 if you want square. That's all accessible here via this menu. The other thing we can do, I'll just reset this again. So if we click on the little icon next to aspect here, we get a little tool and we can just draw a bounding box over the part of the image that we want. We'll reset that. Here, this isn't really the type of image that we'll need to worry about straightening, but let's say this landscape. We'll come in here and we'll go to our crop tool and we're going to work on the angle here. So you can do this a couple of different ways. You can use this slider. You can click on the value and use a left to right motion as well. It'll move a little more granular. We can come here to the image and there's a little adjustment point here in the midpoints on either side. You get that little, double arrow. If you hover off of it a little bit, you'll turn it into a curved arrow, and that allows us to actually do the same thing. Now you'll notice that we do end up cropping some of the image out when we straighten it. That's just how this has to work. If we're going to be tilting it to change the angle, it's going to have to get rid of some of the edges. Last but not least, we can click on this little angle tool here and you can find your horizon, in this case, the edge of the lake. You can click and drag and line up this line with what your horizon is. Let go and it will make the adjustment. Here we can see we're pretty much bang on, so it barely changed it at all. You'll notice that we have a little check box here, constrained to image. You can check it. It's not going to appear to do anything. In fact, it's not going to actually come into play or have any purpose for you unless we scroll all the way to the bottom here and we land on the transform menu here at the bottom. Unless we're doing some transformations, and I'll show you here, if you see there's constrained crop in the transform window, and there's constraint to image in the crop and straighten window. If I click one, it turns the other one on, and vice versa. So this is the same, essentially the same function. It's just in two different places, because if you play around with this, you might actually need to turn it on or off, or more than likely off, if you were then straightening your image or changing the crop over here. So we don't really have to worry about that right now. That's delving a little bit deep, but that's what that is. You can kind of forget about it at the moment as we go through some of these other tools. We're going to go back here and grab Brad, or, well, I hope he enjoys the name Brad. It just seems like a Brad to me. So we're in crop. We now go into the healing tool. Now the healing tool has three different options here. First is content aware. You can change the size and the opacity. What does that mean? Well, when you mouse over the image, you can actually use the scroll wheel to do this. You can change the size of the tool. Here, if we go, actually we'll just zoom in for now. Here we can use the slider to change the size as well. Opacity means that we're changing how opaque the effect of the tool is. 100% means it's like completely non-transparent, completely opaque. It will cover up whatever we are trying to heal. If we reduce it, it's going to mean that our healing patch is going to be a little bit transparent. If we go all the way to 1, extremely transparent. But to give you an idea, let's imagine that we are trying to get rid of this crease. So we just kind of draw over it and let go. And we let Lightroom use content aware, I guess, fill or however you want to actually. That's very similar to one of the Photoshop tools. But it's going to attempt to rebuild what it thinks should be here. In this case, you can see it didn't really do a great job. We got some blurry bits down here. I guess it does accomplish getting rid of the creases or the little bit of the frown lines there, but that's maybe not what we had in mind. Here I accidentally put a second little spot here, so I'm going to just click on it. You can actually move it around. You'll see it'll reanalyze, and I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to delete it just so it goes away. Poof, it's gone. Here I'm going to click on this one here, and you see now we have this command and drag on the photo to select a custom source. Well, let's say it pulled the source, the thing that it is using sort of to patch this up, from a place where we didn't think it should, but we think maybe, I don't know, up here would be good. If we hold command and we drag, we can select an area as our custom source. We can let go and it will reanalyze things and then attempt to reconstruct things based on whatever we selected. In this case, it actually looks somewhat better, but we can come back here again and delete it. So let's move on to the healing tool here. We have a very similar brush, very similar tool. And again, the size can be changed from the slider, can be changed with your scroll wheel. We have opacity, which does the same thing, but you'll notice we also have 2 circles now and a new feather slider. And if we move the feather slider, we see as we go towards the left-hand side, towards 0, we end up with 1 circle. As we come towards 100%, the second circle in the middle kind of shrinks down towards the center. What this means is that the middle portion of the tool that's bound by the slightly brighter white line is actually going to have the full effect of our brush. So if we have our opacity at 100%, let's say, it's going to be 100% opaque. The edge of the second circle, the bigger circle, is going to be the point at which things go to 0. That's the point at which it's not going to affect anything anymore. And the middle portion in between those 2 lines is going to be how much feathering there is, which is to say that there will be a steady gradient from completely opaque to completely transparent. And the bigger that gradient, the more the softer the fall off will be, basically. And if it's very tight gradient, there's going to be a real short fall off. So it's going to be a little bit harder. And these might be more or less appropriate for different things. But let's go over here and we'll try it here with those little wrinkles again. And now we see something different. We see the patch we made, but there's an arrow pointing to it from this patch over here. This is where Lightroom thinks it should replace this. Like, this is the source, and it's literally just copy paste it. If I click and select this part, I can actually now tweak it a little bit. I can tweak the opacity, and you watch how it kind of disappears. And if I go reappears, we're getting these hairs appearing over here. That's what the opacity does. We can actually edit things. If we come over here, the source patch, we can click and drag it around and maybe find someplace better. I mean, that looks That looks pretty stock. I'd say anyone would have a hard time figuring out if that was not his actual face. That said, we're just going to reset the tool here. And lastly, we have clone stamp. And clone stamp, is very, very similar. Here we're literally just finding an area and we're stamping it. There is less. Here, I'll demonstrate this. If you'll take a look. Here we have our destination. Here we have our source. Clone stamp, you're just copy pasting part of the image here and it's ending up here. You can see that leads to maybe a little bit of a disconnect here. It's a lot darker at the source than it is at the destination. So we're going to reset that. We're going to go back to the healing tool. We're going to do pretty much the exact same thing. Why are we getting a different result, you might wonder? Well, the healing tool is doing a little bit of extra work in the background for us. Whereas the cloning tool is literally just copying, cutting out this portion and pasting it on this portion. But yeah, they both have their place. In this case, I think our healing tool actually worked a little bit better, but that's how you use these three options. We're just going to reset that and we're going to go to our next icon here, which is red eye correction or pet eye correction. Red eye because humans have retinas that are, part of our body. They're full of blood. They appear red. And when you have, let's say, a really harsh flash from like a point and shoot camera, it might illuminate the retina and that redness will, bounce back to the camera. Pet eye is a little bit different. Pet eye is because many domesticates, such as cats and dogs, actually have reflective coatings on the backs of their eyes to help them see better in the dark. When, it's dark or nighttime, light will come into their eyes and it'll bounce around a little bit more and they'll be able to see better. However, if you try and take a flash photo of your pet, especially in a darkened room, you might notice that their eyes might glow anywhere from green to silver to yellow, and pet eye correction will fix this. If we just go red eye, we'll see we have a elliptical tool here. That's because unless you are taking a photo of somebody head on, like stock straight, and their eyes are looking directly into the camera, you're more than likely going to be seeing them off angle. Now here I have a bit of a issue. This is sort of a quick tangent. I have this tool open. I'm zoomed in on Brad's face. I want to work on the eye. It's kind of in an awkward spot. I can't scroll around with my mouse and there's no scroll bars here. How do I actually do this? Well, you come up here to the navigator where it really is living up to its name. You go to the bounding box here that's showing us our zoomed in portion. You click, you hold, and you bring it to where you want it to. That's your quick tangent. So as I was saying, the reason this tool is elliptical is because you're more than likely going to be taking a photo of a circular hole from the side, which means that from your perspective, the height is going to be the same, but you're actually going to diminish the horizontal component here. So any pupil that's not facing the camera directly will always be slightly ellipsoidal. Anyway, you can resize this tool if you need to. However, if you just click on the middle of the eye and you drag outwards, you see we'll actually make a new one. And it can be whatever shape. If you go up and down, it can be really tall. Left and right, it can be really wide. But we can try and match it and make it fit perfectly the pupil. Now imagine here that Brad's pupil was red, for instance, because this is red eye correction. In this case, it's not. So I think probably we let go. It's unable to find a red eye. But if we did have red eye, here what would happen is it's essentially just going to take that area and it's going to turn the red black and going to make the photo look quote unquote proper. That is your red eye tool. Now we'll go to actually probably a much more useful tool, especially contemporaneously. This is the masking tool, and masking is a way where you are selecting parts of an image that you can make selective edits on, where those edits don't affect other parts of the image. So here we have subject, sky, and background. And this is, using AI to figure out which one might be in your photo. It used AI here to basically find our subject. And as you just saw, when I mouse over, it'll actually paint red on top of them and show you where it detected a subject. And here, that's pretty darn good. It's got, maybe a bit of softness and whatever up here near the hair, but for all intents and purposes, it kind of cut Brad out from the photo there, which is great. That's exactly what we want. You do have other choices here. Objects, you can draw a box around something that maybe it didn't know to find, and it will do it. Brush, you can literally paint much in the same way as when we did the healing tool. Same type of cursor there, and you can do some brushing and select areas you want. And there's gradients here as well, and ranges for color and luminance. So lots of options, but here we'll just start with the one that it gave us. It's going to create a mask here. Now we get a lot of choices. We can just do the face, body, eyebrows, the sclera, the white parts of the eye, iris and pupil, lips. You've given some lipstick. This is incredible. This is, even a few years ago, this was like science fiction. This is pretty useful. You can do all kinds of stuff with that. Today, we're just going to use the entire person. We're going to create mask, and you'll see it pops up this new window here. And here it will have a big button that says create new mask. We don't need to at this moment because we have one. And here you can see it's in black and white. In Photoshop land, or I should say Adobe app land, encompassing both Photoshop and Lightroom, of course, black conceals and white reveals. So when you see these white on black, basically what this means is that the mask is the white portion and the black portion is the part that's not going to be affected. And I'll show you what I mean. We're going to come right over here to the exposure slider. And you notice he's all highlighted in red. That's due to this icon where it has the color selected and the show overlay checked, and it will show you exactly where the mask is. This will go away in a moment, but you can also overlay in other modes. If you come to the bottom toolbar, you can click on color and you can change it to all kinds of things. Image on black and white, or you can do white on black, which is exactly what we see up here. This is a good way to do it. If you really want to see just the outlines, color overlay is the default one. You'll see show edit point pins. This little icon is the edit pin. It's on auto right now. We can go always. We can go when it's selected, or never if you never want to see that little thing. We'll just leave it on auto. And we'll click off show overlay here. So as I was saying, we've got our subject selected. If we're just going to come over here, we now have a new window. And I'll take a moment to scroll down. See, there's a ton of adjustments. And a lot of this is going to look familiar. This is actually, with the light gray, in large part, cloned from, and here we get back to our regular scheduled editing tools. It's very much a copy paste of a lot of stuff that's in your editing tools here, but this is just going to affect the masked portion. But I keep getting ahead of myself. So here we have exposure. I'm just going to crank the exposure briefly, and you'll see no matter what I do, it's not actually changing the background here. Here we're blowing out our subject's face. He's quite illuminated, but the background remains dark. I'll just reset this. If I go all the way back down here, find basic exposure, and I lighten that up, here you see we're lightening up everything. But when we're dealing with the masked portion, we're only highlighting this one particular part of the image. Now, if I really crank it up, you can see it didn't do a perfect job around his hair over here. This is some of the background, and behind his neck here, it missed that. So let's say we want to remove that from the mask. We don't want that to be affected here. We can come up to the mask window, and below our mask, mask 1, and again it has person 1, we have 2 buttons, add or subtract. As you can imagine, these add and subtract. We're going to click on subtract, and you get much of the same options you did before. Right now we're going to choose brush, and that brings up this little brush menu. Now, size, feather, we're familiar with those. Flow and density, what does that mean? Well, I'll demonstrate that in a moment. There's an auto mask feature if you want it to think about what you're trying to do and take a guess and do it for you. Over here, we have A and B. This lets you set up 2 different brushes, because maybe you needed a big brush and a small brush, or a hard brush or a soft brush, and you don't want to have to change things every time. You can have 2 brushes, and that let you do your masking to your heart's content. You also have erase. Once we put some masking down, or in this case I guess you could think of it, since we're doing subtraction, anti-masking, or counter-masking, we can come up here and do erase, and we can actually refine that, which I'll show you in a moment. Here we have invert. This will invert the mask. So where, if we draw in a certain spot, we click this, it'll actually make everywhere we drew not be the mask, and everywhere we didn't draw become the mask, or vice versa, depending on if you have add or subtract selected. I hope that makes sense, but it will basically invert your work. It'll make the black white and the white black. However, I'm just going to adjust, feather a little bit, and maybe a little bit less. And I'm going to undo, and you watch it's just turning black because this is happening real time. So, you know what? I think I maybe did that a little too hard on the edge. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to erase it. Click on erase. You get basically a lot of the same tools. So I'm just going to get something that's feathered, and I'm going to come and just put the feathered edge along here. And what it's going to do, it's going to not actually delete, or it's not actually going to erase all of that counter mask. What it's actually going to do is it's going to make the edge more transparent, because that's what feathering does. If I keep going over and over and over, sure, it'll erase it all, but I think that works pretty well. We'll click back to A here. So what does flow and density mean? Well, see, we'll show an overlay here. Flow, you can imagine that this brush, and that's why it's called a brush, is a watercolor. Flow deals with how much paint is coming off the brush. So we'll just do this. We'll just, take all the feathering out here. Click. Not to say that we just put a hole in Brad's head. Sorry, Brad, but here what we're doing is we're subtracting that. Flow and density are all the way up. Let's take the flow almost all the way down, and we'll do another one. Well, that's quite odd, isn't it? Nothing happened. That's because the flow controls how much quote unquote paint, and we didn't have very much. If I click a bunch of times in the same area, get no effect, we can boost that flow a little bit. Click again. Oh, I think we're getting closer. There we go. That's adding a little bit at a time there. And you see what's happening is it's not able to erase or subtract all of the mask. So we're actually, even though our density is 100%, even though our paint is completely opaque, since we don't have enough of it, it's not enough to actually accomplish this, complete, I guess, dark circle that we made here. We'll try the opposite. I'm going to crank the flow all the way up. I'm going to crank the density all the way down. And we'll try right next to it. As you can expect, nothing's happening. I have to click a lot of times to get some results there. I'm going to up the density 50%. And there we go. So here what we have, full flow, we're putting down the maximum amount of paint per click, but the density of the paint is only at 50. So you can think of this as, a very watery watercolor paint. It needs several coats to kind of have the maximum effect. And if I come here and expand it, you'll notice that no matter how many times I click, and if I kind of Venn diagram them over, we never actually can get to the pure black here because the density will only ever be 50%. The amount of paint is only ever going to be half. If we kind of change that around, go flow 50, density 100, we can achieve, by clicking many, many times, the same results as if both were all the way to 100%. I hope that makes it a little easier to think about how these brushes work or flow and density works based on, paint, because essentially that's what you're doing. So now we have a little bit of an issue. I was showing you all of this stuff, but it's kind of mucked up with the mask. I mean, look at this. That can't stand. So what do? Well, we can actually come up here. It says our mask 1, brush 1. That's what we're doing right now. There's these 3 little dots. We can click on those. We can do all kinds of stuff from renaming it. We can invert the masks, but we can also delete it. Now we're back to our standard bit, although here this part that we fixed is kind of gone again. So I'll hit subtract again, brush. I'll choose a little bit of feathering this time. And I will come over here and I will just paint over this a couple of times. We'll change it just a little bit. You can see here, it's maybe like a little line or something, so we want to clean that up. But there. And now if we come back to our normal mask here, and we adjust things here, we're not actually brightening this portion here. Now, no matter what you do to it, let's say you bump the exposure and you change the temperature, you want to make it seem like Brad here is in a cold room with harsh lighting, maybe in front of a television late at night. It's very specific, watching infomercials. Who knows what he could be up to? Now we have, a bit of a different look. I'll just reset this really quick. We've got a completely different look to our image. And, well, let's say we think maybe it's a little too much. So you select the mask, and we can actually come up here. It says amount, and we can lower or increase the amount of the mask. Basically, it's going to add a multiplier to everything we've done. So here we can actually tone it down a little bit. So really powerful tool. We'll delve more into it later, but you can see there's a ton of stuff that you can do with that. especially as you come through all the way through this menu. There's so many different options. For now, we're going to click back on the edit menu, and I'm going to reset our Brad back to stock Brad. And we're going to come here, white balance. Actually, let's start at the top of the window here. We have three choices. HDR. HDR stands for high dynamic range. What we have actually is a standard dynamic range image. HDR is a way that you can add more dynamic range. So if you want to think of it, more shades of gray in between pure black and pure white. And you can make an image that's really, really pops. Unfortunately, at the moment, an HDR image like that requires a device that can actually display it in HDR. So there are some of those on the market, but they are not really widespread. And because of that, this is not maybe something that you're going to want to do. Chances are you're actually going to be editing it on a standard definition display, or a standard dynamic range display rather. And if you try and display an HDR image on an SDR display, it's going to kind of look bad. Much better to just kind of leave that to a point in the future where everyone's phone and everyone's laptop has an HDR display. We have two other choices here, auto and black and white. Black and white's pretty simple. If we click that, it will turn the image monochrome. This has its time and place, and we'll talk more about that later. Auto, on the other hand, this is going to give the program the leniency to try and make the image quote unquote well exposed to whatever it thinks it should be exposed at. In this case here, we see that it's brightened up the background, brightened up the subject's face. It's kept things a little bit to the left side of the histogram to keep from blowing out the whites and the highlights. But for the most part, we've actually lost the intent of the image because the program itself doesn't know what our artistic intent was. Just reset this. You can see the lighting choices here are very deliberate. It's meant to have, we got flash coming in here from the side or some type of incident light, got a bit of Rembrandt lighting, but mostly we've got that, the darkness. So that's artistic intent. Auto might not be the best for that. If you've got something, just like your grandma's birthday, everyone's outside and you're taking a group photo and you want something easy, you just want to throw something easy at it, you can hit auto and start there. And it will do a decent job of giving you a quote-unquote well-exposed image. That being said, here we're going to do a little bit of work on Brad. Here we have profiles. We have camera standard selected. We have a bunch of different ones here, mostly from Adobe. If we click on this little set of icons here, it'll bring us to this profile browser. Now you might be asking yourself, what are profiles? Well, we've got a bunch of different types of, I hesitate to call them presets because they're not really editing presets. On the left-hand side, we have our editing presets. This, if I click on one of these, will apply different edits to the actual image that we can then undo. Profiles are more of a different starting point, and there's all kinds of different ones. I have some here. These are ones I use with processing film that I've scanned myself, color negative film, where you need to actually have this plugin. It will reverse things for you. So it has some of its own little profiles built in, but for the most part, I might actually suggest just kind of leaving this be for now. We'll close that. But that's what's happening up here. Camera standard, it's going to be whatever our camera was. In this case, a Hasselblad. So below that, here we have white balance. We have as shot selected. So as shot is going to be whatever you selected in the camera. If you had auto white balance on, it's going to be whatever the camera decided was the correct white balance. Now, this is just your starting point. one of the reasons we shoot in RAW is so that we can change this specifically to many different things. If we click on As Shot, we'll get a little menu here that has a bunch of different options. Auto, daylight, cloudy. You'll notice that these actually line up with some of the menu options in your own camera's white balance menu. That's because these will apply a certain color temperature and tint based on the way that these types of lighting conditions affect a photo. And you are more or less trying to correct the photo's color cast essentially for whatever, is quote unquote correct, usually, daylight type representation. So if you're ever in a place that has really yellow incandescent lighting, those photos tend to not look always so appealing. You can actually use, let's say, I think it would be tungsten, I believe. But you can use the appropriate choice or some of the other options we'll talk about here in a moment to correct that white balance back to something that's a little bit more natural. Here we'll see we have two sliders, temperature and tint. Temperature is blue to yellow. It's pretty simple. The yellower we go, the more quote unquote warm we get. We can actually come over here and fine tune things by just scrolling. If we click on the numbers themselves, changing things that way. Here, using the slider can be a bit of a more a heavy-handed process. If we come to the left, well, now Brad's feeling a bit blue because we're in the blue side of the temperature spectrum. That said, we already were pretty close over here, so there's not a lot of cool image data captured in this file. There's a lot of warm image data captured, not a ton of cool, but we still do have enough leeway that we can make it work. Tint deals with green and magenta. So you can make things look a little bit more green or a little bit more magenta, and depending on the individual photo, you might have need to adjust this one way or the other. Usually we touch this one a little bit less. We don't necessarily always need to change it. Maybe if skin tones are coming out a little bit wrong, a little bit too green, for instance. Maybe you took a photo outside in a green field on a sunny day, surrounded by greenery. It can reflect and turn your subject's skin tones a little bit green. You can bring it back towards magenta. But we tend to actually use the temperature slider here to change things because that can change the look and feel. If we warm Brad up a little bit, it gives us a bit of a feel compared to if we cool him off a little bit. This is subtle, but it is telling our brains something, and we can use this to great artistic effect. Here, if we grab the eyedropper, and just going to remind myself of where the black areas of the photo are. This eyedropper tool is used for selecting neutral. So let's say you had something pure black, pure white, or some type of shade of gray, and it had no other color. It was gray, 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 gray. And no matter what color it shows up in your photo, if you knew it was completely monochrome, completely neutral, and you can see we have a little preview window that pops up now. It says pick a target neutral. We could select this portion essentially, and it would we could select our neutral, and it would tell the software what the proper white point should be. It'll calculate based on knowing that it should be neutral, and if it has a little bit of a color cast, it knows to undo that color cast for the whole image. In this case, we can see, if you go look at the navigator, as I mouse around, things will change wildly in ways that just can't possibly be correct. So that is because we're not actually finding a neutral. This is why we have things like color checkers or gray cards that sometimes you can actually have your subject hold up for one frame. Then you get, with that particular lighting situation, a good idea of what the correct quote unquote color should be. But in this case, we don't really have that. So if I were to select this, for instance, well, it made them look a little bit green. That's not really what we want. So we'll undo it, but that's what the eyedropper here is for. And if you do have the requisite target neutral to sample, it can really be a time saver. We'll come down here. We have two more chunks, I guess, to the basic window. We have tone and presence. Tone is where you'll spend a lot of your time. This is, again, we gave a little bit of a preview of it a moment ago when we talked about the histogram. But this is where you change a lot of the shadows and a lot of the exposure of the image. This is where, shooting in RAW really can make a big difference, because you might not need to get the exposure 100% correct in camera. A RAW image gives you a bit of leeway. So we'll just start at the top, exposure. You crank the exposure up. We can see here our histogram changes. It moves to the right a little bit. All of a sudden we're getting, a lot of highlights coming from here. We've got things coming more into the shadows. Here we've got shadows. This is all shadows. So this is pretty good. We've got a lot of stuff to work with. We're not really clipping on either side. But, obviously this is, not what we want. So we can actually come down and adjust things. Under exposure, we have contrast. And contrast will either remove some dynamic range, giving a little bit more of a dramatic look, or increase some dynamic range and basically watch the histogram here. We'll get two different shapes. When we have low contrast, we'll get this bell curve shape where there's nothing really in the blacks or the whites or what have you. And here you can see it looks a little bit washed out, a little bit gray. And if we increase the contrast, the curve will change and it gets more of a saddle shape here, where it groups itself up along the two edges for the blacks and the whites, and not a lot in between here. So we don't get a lot of midtones. We don't get a lot of shades of gray. It's, trying to be, very contrasty, hence the name. But there are other ways to introduce contrast as well, which we'll talk about. Now we're moving on to highlights. So we've raised the exposure, but even though we've made a lot of the image well exposed, we've overexposed the face here. So I know for a fact that these are highlights. So I can take the highlights, I can bring it down a little bit. And all of a sudden, I've got a very even exposure over our subject's face. Not completely, obviously. Here's highlights, here's a shadow, but it's much better than this. Shadows, if you watch here, you can see what happens when we raise the shadows or lower the shadows. It's going to affect various parts of the image differently. For now, we'll just leave that there randomly. Whites is the real bright stuff. So if we up the whites, well, now it looks like maybe our friend Brad here is getting abducted by aliens. If we bring the whites down back to their starting position and then bring them past, you'll notice actually there's not a lot of effect here. It's because there's not really a lot of whites to play with. If you remember, these sliders affect different portions of the image, but those portions have to land in a certain range to be affected. So it decreases the intensity of luminance across the whole image, but not really discernibly, right? Now, I should mention here, you see we've got a white and then red and green and blue. These represent different color channels and how luminant they are in, whichever part of the image. Blue, green, and red, obviously. Now, where they intersect, you'll see white. So this is a combination of all of them. They're all highest about at this portion here, but the blues are a little bit more into the blacks relative to the greens, and the reds in the image are a little less intense. This white actually also coincidentally is representing the parts of the red that are silhouetted with green and blue here. So that is kind of what's happening there. Put that aside, and we'll come back down here to the shadows and whites and the blacks. If we pull the blacks up, you'll see the histogram moves to the right a little bit. We're pushing things away from this portion. We're getting them out of the blacks. So it's actually having the effect of brightening the image. If we come and we lower the blacks, you'll see it will start to darken the parts of the image that are within its purview. And these are methods by which you can really get granular with some of this exposure and what have you. That's it. I'm just going to reset that. We've got our standard issue Brad. Raise the exposure again a little bit. And I'll bring you to presence, the last part of the basic window here. So presence has two portions: texture, clarity, and dehaze, and then vibrance and saturation. Texture is kind of what it sounds like. If we crank it up, it's going to sharpen the image somewhat and give it a little bit more texture. You can see the pores and the lines in Brad's face a little bit more. If we go the opposite, you can see things soften up quite a bit. So we're taking away some of that sharpness and replacing it with softness. Maybe Brad wants like a little bit of face tuning because he's gonna, well, I guess you don't really post photos on TikTok, do you? Forget I said anything. So that's texture. Clarity is dealing a little bit more, I'd like to say, with micro contrast. So as you bump clarity up, you can see that while the general contrast of the image doesn't seem to change that much. Let's see how I can reset that and show you. Right? When we bump the general contrast, the parts of the image go dark, other parts go bright. But when we do clarity, it's like it's happening, but it's happening on a much smaller scale. So this is where we can essentially add a little bit of extra contrast into the mix here, just on a micro scale. And that can, I mean, if we really go hard on it, this is a very dramatic, this feels like the type of editing that you'd see somebody do if they're taking pictures of coal miners or oil workers or something. But we'll reset that for now. And we come here and we have dehaze. I'm going to demonstrate dehaze by trying it backwards first. Oh, which reminds me, clarity, when we undo the clarity, it really gets rid of that micro contrast. And it does appear to soften the image somewhat, but it's a bit of a different representation as opposed to texture. Yeah, that will kind of take some of that micro contrast out. With dehaze, we'll start by going backwards. And you see, if we dehaze, essentially we're hazing. And what we do is we haze it with a specific kind of tone here, a specific color. You notice that it kind of applies itself around depending on the luminance of various parts of the image, but it does seem to have like a consistent color cast. Well, if you go in the opposite direction, instead of adding that in, it will start to actually take it away. You can see here our image got maybe arguably a little pinky, little magenta, little pinky. Come the other way, it's almost getting a little green maybe. Dehaze is something like, let's imagine that you took a photo, on a smoky day, or maybe there's some haze in the sky, or you're doing wildlife or landscape, and your composition's far away, And the further away you go, you get that atmospheric haze. You can actually cut this using this tool because that haze will introduce a consistent color cast to the whole image. It might soften the image. It might introduce, a little bit of obfuscation of, whatever you're taking a photo of far away, but it will do so in a certain color. And this dehaze can actually counteract that, which can be quite useful. Just reset the image here again, bump up the exposure a little bit. Lastly, we have vibrance and saturation. Vibrance, as you might expect, increases the vibrancy of colors. If I go all the way to the left, getting pretty monochrome, all the way to the right, well, now it looks like our fair Brad here has some really magenta lipstick on, but this is not the same as saturation. This is the sort of the intensity or the presence of the colors specifically. Whereas saturation is, just the sheer amount of said color. So we've got, again, all the way to monochrome, and then, oversaturated, which is where the term actually comes from, of course. We've got like yellowy patches happening. The hair is turning a little bit, too green. It's accentuating different colors. So here, now we'll actually stack that with vibrance. You can see how it makes them a little bit more punchy, and that is quite a look. So these are best used in moderation, typically. Sometimes you might choose to use one and subtract the other, or leave them both at 0, leave one at 0, do something else with the other one. There's no right or wrong here. This is all individual, personal preference, what the image needs. But typically the results, if you go all the way to the stops here, are unnatural, or maybe a little bit Jersey Shore. Who knows? Reset that, and we'll come down here now to the tone curve. And you know what? I think we're going to leave the tone curve for next class. This has already gone on quite a bit long. So thank you for tuning in. And your next set of video notes will follow this one. So take care, and I'll see you then.